so glad that you've chosen to spend some time with us tonight. A little bit about Billy. Billy Cochrane is a dual U.S. and Canadian citizen who moved to Ontario 8 years ago. He has taught public school remedial reading in some of the most distressed communities in the United States, as well as doing grassroots literacy training outside of school settings. He is a U.S. military veteran, an entrepreneur, husband of Lisa, and father of Raven and Thaddeus. Now retired, he seeks opportunities to serve where he is able and where the need is greatest. He is an active member of St. Paul's family, serving on church council and as assisting minister, and other things as needed. He has traveled twice in the last 2 years to serve as a volunteer at Annunciation House in El Paso, Texas, near the U.S.-Mexico border. It is from these experiences that he has developed tonight's presentation. Billy.
Thank you so much. The opinions I express tonight are just that. They're my opinions based on my own experience. Having been raised as an Anglican Episcopalian and having come of age in the 1970s, the connection that I feel to the work of Annunciation House Shelters, which is a Catholic organization, has uncovered for me the fact that I'm a Protestant very influenced by Catholic social teaching, as expressed through liberation theology. It is really amazing what travel reveals about a person. I had no idea that I had an inner Catholic waiting to emerge. But working in the Catholic shelter, I really found a great deal of resonance with my own beliefs. I want to tell you tonight about an immersive experience of service that I had. What I learned about the motivations and concerns of migrants from Central and South America and the forces affecting their lives, and what I have learned about being in solidarity with and serving the marginalized and poor in one particular North American context. Through that experience, I have been genuinely transformed in my understanding of two related concepts that I just named: service and solidarity. This is an NDP t-shirt some of you may recognize. I believe that I lived into the mindset that service and solidarity create as concepts during my time as a teacher, a reading teacher in the US. But it was really in post-retirement, during my 6 weeks of training, working, and living in the shelter system in Texas in 2024, that gave me a much deeper understanding of the meaning of those two concepts, and even more importantly, the connection between them, between service and solidarity, and their importance in addressing humanitarian concerns as a person of faith. So here's the route we'll follow. First, I'll talk about my starting point. To understand where I ended, I must be honest about where I started. Frankly, I was in an angry and very political frame of mind in January 2024. It was a starting point that I didn't recognize at the time as the starting point of a journey, and it was a starting point not particularly focused on the migrant experience per se. And I will, in this presentation, illustrate the headspace I was in and why I was as angry as I was. Then I hope to give you a sense of the many reasons the people we call migrants leave home, remembering that one emigrates before one is a migrant. I then will also share impressions of the culture of Texas, and we'll kind of narrow it down. Then the culture of El Paso, then the culture of the shelter, the guests, and then the nature of the work itself. So we'll kind of start from a broad perspective and narrow down. I will offer a Christian perspective through my experience in Annunciation House shelters of how I lived the difference between helping and serving. And I'll offer a set of guiding principles used in Annunciation House that create the framework, the mindset, in which a transformed way of living in a broken world can occur. Now, as we begin, I'd like you to really keep that distinction, the difference between helping and serving, in mind. Ask yourself, and just think about this as my presentation opens up, How would you approach creating a simple answer to the question, what's the difference? What's the difference between helping and serving? How would you answer that if you had to explain it to a child in just a few words? So we'll begin by placing ourselves in Texas. Let's start the journey with Texas and the American frontier myth and mentality, which influences deeply the political side of migration debates in the US. And I need you now to listen to a little bit about Texas.
The world is full of complainers. But the fact is, nothing comes with a guarantee. Now, I don't care if you're the Pope of Rome, President of the United States, or Man of the Year. Something can all go wrong. And go ahead, complain, tell your problems to your neighbor, ask for help, and watch him fly. Now, in Russia, they got it mapped out so that everyone pulls for everyone else. That's the theory, anyway. But what I know about is Texas. And down here, you're on your own.
That is the voiceover that opened a movie in 1984. And so when he refers to Russia and the theory of them pulling for one another, he's actually referring to the communist system that was in place at that time. But I used it for this presentation because that idea, down here, you're on your own, is what the migrants are encountering when they arrive. And they're desperately needy, and they're coming into a culture that does not necessarily embrace the same communitarian spirit that you find here in Canada. It's much more of a sort of John Wayne, you take your rifle and your family and you go out and somehow tough it out yourself. And that is a difficult environment to enter as a disoriented and frightened migrant. It is a stark formulation, but it does express to me, as an American, the Texan frame of mind. Now, that being said, El Paso is a bit different. Like parts of Louisiana, El Paso is very culturally distinct from the rest of its state, in part due to its far southwestern location. It is about as far west and south as you can get in Texas, as you'll see there on the map. The 2020 population from the US Census Bureau of El Paso was 678,000 people. El Paso sits directly on what is sometimes called Frontera Brava, a 3,200-kilometer border strip where many forces, economic, social, and political, converge. El Paso is at the intersection of 3 states, Texas, New Mexico, and the Mexican state of Chihuahua, 2 countries and 3 cities, Las Cruces, New Mexico, Juarez, New Mexico, and El Paso. Together, those 3 cities, sometimes called the Borderplex, hold 2.7 million people. It is the largest bilingual and binational workforce in the Western Hemisphere. And as a result, it is a little different, a little bit distinct from the rest of Texas and from the sort of broad sense of you're on your own that you got in the voiceover. El Paso is just a little bit more of a compassionate place in some ways. It is known as one of the safest cities in the US, but unfortunately no city can escape the rising trend of naked, unapologetic bigotry in America. And we'll go to the next slide. This is a memorial called the Candle Memorial at the Walmart in El Paso. In August 2019, 21-year-old Patrick Wood Crusius drove 650 miles specifically to kill Mexicans in El Paso. He shot 45 people in the El Paso Walmart, killing 23 and injuring 22 others. El Paso, however, refuses to be defined by this event. This is a piece of public sculpture that I think really says something about the spirit of El Paso. Right in the area near the border is this beautiful door. I was almost run over trying to take the picture because, of course, I wanted to frame it, from the street view. But I think it says a lot about El Paso. And I want to make a reference, too, about us as Canadians. I like to think of myself as a citizen of North America, not just a Canadian or an American. And so events that happen in El Paso along the 3,200-mile border with the United States will influence us here. The border with Mexico is the doorstep of North America and is, in a sense, the doorstep to Canada, too. The problems that are arriving across that border will be our problems sooner or later. And so that gateway is not just a gateway to El Paso, but to all of North America, including us. So let me now, having tried to place you a little in Texas, get you a little closer to understanding El Paso, the original border town. And we have two scenic overviews. This is from a vantage point that above the city, and you may not quite be able to see it, but if you see the large building in the middle with the little gold stripe on top and the two black arrows, well, if you follow toward the front of the picture from that building, you should see a faint red circle. I think I have to probably do a little better at highlighting that. But that's the building that is the shelter. That's where I spent 6 weeks. It's a church that was built in 1961, and Annunciation House leased it while they were renovating another building. And so that's the building, and everything where the two arrows are, that's the wall. That's the border with Mexico. It's an easy walk. It's maybe a 20-minute walk from the shelter downhill to the border itself. Okay, next slide. The X is in Mexico, and apparently across hundreds of miles of the border, the word Mexico is spelled out. It's spelled out in these giant letters, and in El Paso, you just get the X. You don't get the rest of them. I was kind of intrigued by that. I'd really like to know where the other letters are. But if you'll look at just in front of the X, you'll see a footbridge. I think I have an arrow over it, and that is actually the foot crossing into Mexico. When you're on the other side of that bridge to the right, you're in Juarez, Mexico. And then you'll see a string of lights moving off from the left and snaking into the distance, and that is the illumination on top of the wall itself. So let's get a little closer now and get downtown El Paso, and this is really the fun part of the presentation for me because it's such a vibrant and exciting place. There's a street that leads right up to the border, El Paso Street, and it's sort of famous in the same way that Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee is famous. So it's got its own gateway arch telling you that you're entering El Paso Street, and straight down that street, a very short walk at the other end, is the border and the bridge. But that distance is fabulous. There are storefronts with all sorts of amazing goods. There are people selling shaved ice with coconut flavoring. There are salsa music blaring out of the storefronts. There are people dancing, and it's absolutely just the most exciting sort of strip to walk down. It's well policed by cops on bicycles. I felt entirely safe there. Many Mexicans come across the border to shop there. It's a very, very diverse and exciting place, and it's one of my absolute favorite places in El Paso. It's also a very useful place for us as volunteers at the shelter. There are certain things the shelter could not provide to the migrants, and we would go downtown. There was in particular a Chinese lady who would sell shoes really cheap, and if she knew you were buying them for the migrant kids, she'd shove extra shoes in the bag for you. And of course, you have to have Elvis. If we're in America, we've got to have Elvis. Dave's Pawn Shop was one of the strangest places I have ever entered in my life. There was a point in my life, probably pre-marriage, when I would have come out with a stuffed monkey and a couple of car hubcaps and a broken radio, but I maintained my cool, and I had traveled with only minimal baggage, so I did not bring those things home. There's a couple other things there. At the top left, and this is my kind of way of illustrating the mix of cultures, those are party dresses, and they're for sale very cheap, and they are for the 15th birthday party that young girls have. And so if and they're garish and fabulous. They're just absolutely amazing. When I first went in, I saw them, I thought, oh my God, this is for drag queens. No, it's for 15-year-old Spanish girls, but it's just, pow! And the music is pumping, and the people are trying on dresses, and everybody's having a good time. And then down in the lower left, you'll see the taco place. That was actually kind of a yuppie taco place. That was not nearly as good as the places with the broken Formica kitchen table and the mismatched chairs that I also ate at. But very much the cuisine in El Paso and the culture and the music are influenced by all of the cultures that you can imagine. Let's go to the next slide. El Paso is a city where public art is very common. There are beautiful murals, and the murals, in my opinion, really respond to that terrible thing that happened at the Walmart. This one was painted in 2022, and the next slide will show you a close-up, and you'll be able to read some of the words on it. I think that El Paso is exemplary as a place where people make public statements about inclusivity and warmth toward the stranger. And I felt very, very comfortable there for that reason. The third mural that you'll see, next slide, will also highlights the indigenous culture that is, of course, very much a part of Mexico and Hispanic culture across Latin America and in the United States. And I thought this one was particularly beautiful. I could do a whole slideshow of the murals around El Paso. It's just absolutely marvelous. Great place to do a walking tour. And you now know more about El Paso by light years than I did the day I arrived in my angry frame of mind. And I want to go back to, now let's put Billy in El Paso and see what we get. Next slide. This is Billy at 19, grinning like a fool because the Army gave me a gun and a helmet, and I was just having the best time that a person could have playing Army. I did that for 4 years on active duty, and then I did 7 years in the National Guard. And I don't actually know what the Canadian equivalent of the National Guard is, but in the United States it's the military, but it's normally under the control of state governors, and normally you respond to tornadoes, hurricanes. I remember once in the Mississippi Guard, we put out a wildfire. That's the sort of thing when they need extra manpower, they call the National Guard. And I was very proud to be a Guard member. I really enjoyed the service aspect of it. As I matured and was a little less the goofy 19-year-old you see there, I got serious about the military as being a part of civic society, and I'm proud of that. The next slide, though, will bring you into my anger. There's another hard part. In Eagle Pass, Texas, that's the Rio Grande River, the governor of Texas mobilized the National Guard to string barbed wire along the edge of the river to stop migrants from crossing the river. To me, this really reflects not El Paso, this is Eagle Pass, and this is Texas, and this is Governor Greg Abbott, and the idea that we have something and you can't have it, and we're going to make sure that you don't get any. You're on your own, the frontier and gun myth. And that frontier and gun myth made this use of the National Guard possible. This use of the National Guard would be unthinkable in New York. It would be unthinkable in maybe 49 other states. But in Texas, the National Guard was deployed to put up razor wire to stop people from wading across the river. You can imagine what happened. This 10 and 8-year-old drowned crossing the river with their mother inside of the National Guard, inside of that barbed wire. When I saw this on CNN, I became almost unreasonably angry. And I guess it came at a point of having watched enough brutality on the news. It was sort of the last straw for me. My wife will tell you, I stood up, I said, that's it, I'm going to Texas. I got on the good old internet. I discovered that Annunciation House had volunteer opportunities. I knew nothing about Annunciation House and nothing about El Paso, really. I bought a ticket, and I volunteered, and I showed up. That was the precipitating event, that drowning, that led to me encountering Ruben Garcia and Annunciation House. And we'll now go to the next slide. Ruben Garcia is called sometimes the saint of the border. He was a protege of Mother Teresa. In fact, on the website, you can see letters that Mother Teresa wrote to him and pictures of them together. And she encouraged him in opening the shelter, his dream of opening the shelter in 1978. He has run that series of shelters, which now is 5 shelters, for 40 years in El Paso. So for him, none of this was new. None of the problems that migrants face was new to him. It was new to me, but in encountering him, I was encountering possibly the best person on the border that I could have met to help me leave my anger behind and start to embrace the concepts of service and solidarity that I mentioned earlier. And I want you to, as you listen to this, keep in mind my request that you think a little bit about the difference between helping and serving, because it's going to be very important in a little bit. So my transformation began immediately when I met him. The first thing that volunteers do, you arrive on Saturday, and Sunday morning you have a meeting with Ruben, and he gives a sort of a sermon to really give you a sense of what he's about. And his sermon the day that I was with him was about the women at the feet of the cross when Christ was crucified. And we'll go to the next slide. This is a painting by Miro that we saw, Lisa and I saw in Barcelona recently, and I took this picture thinking about this presentation and about Rubens' talk. In that setting, and I'd never thought about the women at the foot of the cross in the gospel story. Everyone leaves. The men leave. Everyone leaves. Jesus is dying. And a handful of women stay, and there's absolutely nothing they can do. Nothing. What they are doing is the ministry, what Rubens calls the ministry of being with. It is simply being with. He talked to us about the role we would play in the shelter from the point of view of hospitality as a ministry and being with migrants whose situations we would not be able to fundamentally alter. His reason for telling us that is really kind of important when I think about it from his point of view, because if you show up wanting to help people, and that's your mindset, you're going to find yourself immersed in a black hole of needs about which you can do absolutely nothing, and that can be emotionally shattering. And so he begins with helping you to understand that there may be nothing you can do except fold towels and spoon out oatmeal and be with. He's run this shelter system for 40 years with no government support, all donations, and Texas wants to close it down. They consider that if you help a migrant move from one of the shelters to a bus station, that you are human trafficking. In fact, when I arrived for my second 3-week stay, a number of volunteers had just left because they were afraid that they would be arrested and charged with felony human trafficking if they assisted migrants getting to the bus station. The governor of Texas has used the attorney general and the legal system, the courts, continually to persecute the shelter system in recent months. And it's gotten quite intense to the point that we now have to have private security in the event that somebody else wants to drive 650 miles. It's a terrible thing to think about. Let's go on to my next picture, which is Rubens at a press conference. I can't tell you what a charismatic and powerful figure he really is. Next slide, please. This is a mural that's in one of the shelters. And it's got a quote from Bishop Oscar Romero, who was murdered in El Salvador in 1980. I want to zoom in on the people to the right. There are 5 children and 2 adults there. The 2 adults were murdered in El Salvador and left 5 children. Rubens adopted all 5 and smuggled them out of Central America. He brought those 5 children out. So my understanding of what is meant by solidarity, and I'm going to focus now on that term and not on service. My understanding of what is meant by solidarity really began with this mural. Rubens Garcia has modeled in his own life a depth of solidarity that is not a goal for the rest of us, but a model of what commitment and skin in the game can really be. His commitment inspires the volunteers to think about the profound difference between helping and serving. I hope you're still working on those ideas. As the Texas governor has tried to use the courts to stop this, the community of El Paso, next slide please, has responded, and this was a rally in support of Annunciation House that took place while I was there, and it was very, very positive. It was an amazing sort of outpouring of civic support, not anger, but love for what Annunciation House had been in El Paso for 40 years. And I'll just quickly tell you a little bit more. I have to watch the time, but the federal government apprehends immigrants if they have crossed the border illegally. And as soon as they're apprehended and processed and make an asylum request, they become illegal legals. They came illegally, but now they have paperwork that shows they've applied for asylum. Once they've done that, the federal government brings them to Annunciation House and drops them off. So the federal government uses Annunciation House. If a house were not there, those migrants would be on the street in El Paso. The city of El Paso sends a bus and helps move them to the bus station and the airport when they're leaving. So the municipality of El Paso is very much in favor of the program. It's the Texas state government, for its own reasons, that wishes to close it. But there is tremendous support both at the municipal level and, believe it or not, at the federal level, because otherwise El Paso would be swamped with people coming out of detention not knowing what on earth to do, people who needed someone to be with. All right. Let's now talk about the migrants themselves. How do they arrive? Why have they left their homes? Where's my box of tissues? Okay. We'll go to the next slide. There it is. New York Times did an absolutely fabulous piece about global migration, and it's one of these interactive video pieces that scrolls, and the map on the right changes and shows you the patterns of migration that they're illustrating in each section. And I have the link for that. There's no paywall, and if you would like to look at the entire New York Times video and read it, it is absolutely fascinating, and I really recommend it. But the point that I want to make is just that headline. People leave because conditions are intolerable. That's why they leave. All right, next slide. After COVID, when things began to really pick up, the largest migration in the world, the largest migration corridor in the world was from Central and South America into Texas, into the United States. And it was a really overwhelming number of people. And I must say that the federal government was not able to at all cope with or process that many people. And it led to problems for private property owners. It led to problems for municipalities, real problems. And I don't want to pretend that those problems did not happen. They did. And there were people in that migrant group who maybe you would not leave with your puppy. Okay, let's also be honest but I will also say that the rhetoric about an invasion of people being released from insane asylums and murderers in prisons, I spent 6 weeks there. I didn't meet one, not one. I met migrants from Bolivia who were Mennonites, who spoke a version of German that was unintelligible to me. I met migrants from the high-altitude tribal areas that spoke a language that no one there spoke. Venezuela alone has 26 recognized tribal languages. No Google app is going to help you with that. And with the Mennonites and with the people from the Andes, it was an absolutely fascinating kind of cultural experience for me. How do you communicate? How do you help a disoriented, frightened person with no language? And it's a remarkable thing. In the shelter environment, in the shelter atmosphere, somehow it works. There were migrants I met from Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador, Mexico. The reasons that they came are generally a desire for economic opportunity, fear of gangs and the violence that emerges when government ceases to function, political persecution, or increasingly, the impact of climate change on subsistence farming. The folks from the Andes, the indigenous people, they had been farming for 10,000 years without any problem at 9,000 feet. All of a sudden, they can't. The Mennonites had been making a fine living until suddenly they can't. The Mennonites were coming to Texas. They were leaving because they could no longer farm. Now, those are small groups of people who are largely subsistence farmers, and so when it fails big for them and they move. But when I talked earlier about these problems being on our own doorstep, the things that are driving the farmers out of the Andes are coming for everyone. This is not a speech about climate change, but I really saw this as the tip of the iceberg, the tip of some of the changes that we may all see in the next 50 years. All right, let's go a little further. That's Panama. In order to get to Texas from South America, you've got to come through Colombia and into Panama through something called the Darien Gap, which is a 60-mile stretch of jungle that separates Colombia from Panama and is one of the most treacherous regions in the world. There are bandits. There are venomous snakes. There is mud. There are raging rivers. There is impassable jungle. I have contacts in the migrant community who have trusted me with their stories about the Darien. One woman in particular, we gave out clothing, fresh clothing for people. One woman's clothing, it looked serviceable, and I said, do you want to keep your clothes? She said, no, I can't, they smell terrible. And I said, no, you're fine, we can wash them, they're fine. And she said, no, I can't get rid of the smell of the bodies. She had come through the Darien. I want to share with you the words of 2 Venezuelan women who have gotten as far as Colombia and decided not to go through the Darien. And I was able to contact them through the grace of a family that I met in Texas in the shelter that referred me back to the family that had not yet left, that wanted to share their story. So they have left Venezuela, they're in Colombia, but have not decided to make this transit. We can go to the next slide. I think the next slide, actually, yeah. This is an article that ran in the Atlantic Monthly, a great magazine. The title was 70 Miles of Hell. A journalist and a photographer decided to do the Darien Gap. They walked it, and it is an absolutely chilling encounter that they barely made it through. And they came well prepared, and they were escorted by marshals, and they had money, and it was just absolutely awful. And I will gladly link you this if you'd like to know more about what migrants experience in the Darien. This article will tell you, and I'll just try to lighten it up a little for myself. I have had the experience of taking 2 toddlers through Walmart near Christmas. All right? I've been in toddler hell. I cannot imagine what it would be like to drag a 3 or 4-year-old through the Darien Gap, and yet I met people who had done that. People leave when conditions are intolerable. And as I said, almost no matter what the intolerable condition, the reception at the border is the same. They're frightened, they're disoriented, they're exhausted, they've walked through the jungle, they're having flashbacks and PTSD. And when I hear my countrymen talk about, what are they coming for? My only answer to that is, you would leave too. This is the exterior of Casa Rita Steinhagen. Each of the 5 shelters in the Annunciation House system is named for someone. Rita Steinhagen was a nun who was apparently a great friend of Ruben Garcia, and so he named the house after her. Building built the same year as this one, 1961, an enormous building that was able to hold hundreds and hundreds of migrants on cots. And we can go on to the next part of this, next slide. The work itself in the shelter is nothing if not unromantic. It is grueling. You are folding Red Cross blankets for hours. You are cooking oatmeal. You are cleaning toilets, the plunger you saw. If you have several hundred people in a building that old, there's work to be done. You're distributing clothing. You're helping people connect to the Wi-Fi. You are keeping the children entertained. I lived in the shelter for the entire 6 weeks, so there was no break from it. Your shift was supposed to be 9 hours, 6 days a week. But every time I stepped out of my little room, there was a migrant with a need. So it's really an 18-hour day. You work until you just can't do it anymore. What you see here is what was, for me, one of the most emotional and wonderful parts of the experience. When they first arrived, they sit in an area in front of a stage in folding chairs, and we'd go up and down the row, and we cut off the government wristbands. And I would cut it and say, "Welcome to America" in Spanish. "Bienvenidos in America." And usually we both burst into tears. They come with ankle monitors, GPS monitors. It's something of an indignity, although truly the bigger indignity is the shoe you see there. In the government detention facility, like all prisons probably everywhere, they take your shoelaces away, so you shouldn't hang yourself. And they give you essentially cheap knockoff Crocs. The Crocs, those shoes are considered to be a huge embarrassment, a humiliation. And when the migrants leave the shelter, we try very hard to get them shoes, because you don't want to be on a bus on your way to Chicago wearing bright orange Crocs that everyone looks at you, knows just exactly where you've just come from. They're your detention shoes. I could cut off the wristband, but the ankle monitor you can't cut off. And the shoes you swap if you have money to swap the shoes. This was one of the best moments, along with cutting off the wristband. And you see in the background, you'll see the chairs and the stage. That's where we cut the wristbands off. And then if it was close to mealtime, we'd move immediately to a meal, and then afterwards take them to get clothing and do other things. But this group, was ready to eat. And you'll see that there's a prayer going on. And this is the part that I found so amazing. The prayer was always led by a migrant. We just asked for a volunteer. It was never a problem to get a migrant to come up and lead the prayer. The problem was getting them to finish it. Halfway through it, they would break down into tears, completely fall apart. And you see what our pastor, Steve Weber, would have called their prayer posture. The way that their heads are bowed, their hands are folded. And again, at risk of getting off topic, these are the people who are released from prisons and mental institutions, the thugs, the violent criminals that are invading the country. You see them there. Next slide. That is a typical meal. I ate that for 6 weeks. Rice, beans, sometimes hot dogs, and a wonderful concoction made with corn flour, not cornmeal, called an arepas, sometimes with a little cheese in it or something else, quite wonderful. But I will say that the typical migrant stay is 3 or 4 days, not 6 weeks. And after 6 weeks, I was entirely ready to have a piece of chicken, I promise you. You know, the plates in the kitchen, we'd prepare those plates and serve them. And then at the bottom, that's dishwashing. It was done by the migrants. We asked for volunteers. 4 or 5 days go by, we get a whole new crop of people in. We've got to teach them how the dishwashing works. But the dishwashing was a lot of fun. It's a camaraderie thing, right? The water, you're doing the dishes, you're putting them in the cabinet. And it was one of those moments like cutting the wristbands off where I really felt I could bond with people. I would ask the supervisor, let me do dishes again. And they're like, okay, you got it, boy. But it was just great. It was just absolutely fabulous. We went downtown where the nice Chinese lady would sometimes give us extra shoes and bought a piñata, which is used at your birthday. We had a kid with a birthday, and it's a big papier-mâché thing filled with candy, and they blindfold the kid and give him something to whack it with. It was all improv, and that was a big hit. And then you'll see the kids grouped up there, coloring. Coloring is a great way for kids to bond, and it was so affirming, just life-affirming for me to see kids be kids. And there they are coloring, drawing pictures of the sun and each other and happy figures, and we took the pictures and pasted them all over the wall. It was just like being a teacher again. Those are the detention shoes that people left behind in a pile. There is the very uninviting and lonesome-looking bus depot, El Paso to LA, where we would have to drop people off and say a prayer and hope that when they got to LA, there was someone who understood being with. There was someone who understood being disoriented and frightened and hungry and broke. And one family didn't have a sponsorship, didn't have any way to leave the shelter, nowhere to go. And I could talk at length about options for leaving the shelter, the free bus the governor provides, which is a travesty. But what they did is they stayed in the shelter for 7 months and worked in the construction industry. And he saved enough money working 7 days a week in construction to buy a used car, and they left under their own speed. And it was a big celebration. It was a big, big, big deal that he was able to achieve that, worked like a dog. And his wife stayed the whole time in the kitchen helping us. The whole time they were there, she was, right-hand person in the kitchen because she really knew the routine after that much time. The guests contact sponsors and they take the free bus. We give them a piece of paper that they can show at the airport that says, please help me find my gate. And there's a group of people at the airport, volunteers from a different organization called Border Corps, and they help you get through security because, of course, the migrants don't understand anything about the belt buckle and the water and the shoes and all that craziness that you have to go through. So they would make sure they got through security and got to their gate. And on the other side is a little piece of paper that you get when you're released from detention that says, welcome to America. Your journey is not yet over. And that's certainly true. So that brings us to the end of the shelter experience. And I've taken you through that because I wanted you to understand the matrix in which I really found personal transformation. And the point of this talk really isn't those photos that I just showed you. It's what came out of it for me. It's what I learned about myself and about the difference between helping and serving and the meaning of solidarity. So I want to switch now back to my core a point, which is, as I have titled here in my notes, a completed transformation. My homecoming was, for my wife Lisa, I fear, a bit like the first return of our offspring from university. I arrived home down 10 pounds with a new t-shirt, exhausted, sick, suitcase full of dirty laundry. But I had left one thing behind that I didn't bring back with me, my anger. My anger was replaced by new questions. Can we go to the next slide? I bought a shirt in El Paso, and it says, migration is a human right. And I have been thinking about that since I put the shirt on, asking myself whether I believe that. It's a complex question, rights. I can stand here and tell you fresh water is a human right. Where does that come from, and who enforces it? It's complex, and I don't know if migration is a human right. What I do know is that the call to assist the stranger, the foreigner, the poor, is in human society a human obligation, one that offers the opportunity to view migrants as equals and join with them in solidarity. And I'm circling around now after an excessively long windup to the relationship between solidarity and service. And this is really, really why I wanted you to be here tonight. Solidarity implies a relationship between equals. So how does that work? How does that work? How do we be equal with the people that I've met? On Mondays, Ruben Garcia, the founder of A House, holds a call for reflection with the staff and volunteers. It's mandatory. There's music, there's readings, there's prayers, there's food. In my day, and in Ruben's day, I assume, it would have been called a rap session. On one Monday, the reflective theme was the inherent tension within the call to live in solidarity with the poor. How do we do that? At the top level was the question, how poor do you have to be in solidarity with the poor? Does it mean renouncing status and power to live side by side with the homeless? Or would this be nothing more than a selfish intrusion? There are other questions. Is it better to buy more expensive organic foods, products that are better for the environment, the workers, and our health? All things as citizens of the planet we should be conscious of? Or do we resort to buying the cheapest food we can find and distribute the savings to the poor? Taking these questions to the extreme, should we even own cars, washers, dryers, and computers? Or should we be forced by our calling to be in solidarity to use public transit, laundromats, and library computers for these needs, as the poor do? Quoting further from the reflection notes of that one Monday that was so meaningful to me, ultimately it's helpful to remember that Jesus was not the poorest person in history, and so our imitation of him does not require us to be either. In a prayer called A Call to Conversion of Conscience, we read, "We are challenged to make a fundamental option for the poor, to speak for the voiceless, to defend the defenseless, to assess lifestyles, policies, and social institutions in terms of their impact on the poor." This phrase, option for the poor, is also known as the preferential option for the poor, and it's a core principle in Catholic social teaching. An option for the poor does not mean pitting one group against another, haves versus have-nots, haves who are willing to give something up and haves who are not willing to give something up. Rather, an option for the poor means strengthening the whole community by assisting those who are most vulnerable. It means prioritizing the needs of the poor and vulnerable above all else, recognizing their inherent dignity. This principle calls for actions that address not only material poverty, but social, cultural, and spiritual forms of marginalization. Living this teaching is at the core of what being in solidarity means. Solidarity is not just about giving charitably, but it applies to our social responsibilities and our manner of living, to logistical decisions concerning ownership and use of goods. The prayer continues, "Let each one examine his or her conscience, a conscience that conveys a new message for our times." Nothing about this is easy. And if I stopped there, it would be platitudes. Our shared reflection, the rap session, was based around questions of this inherent tension of being in solidarity and of doing the work that we were doing in the shelter. My contribution in the rap session had to do with the tension my wife and I faced, and in fact, her parents faced in raising her as well, when it came to school placement for our children. Do we want to place our children in an environment where they'll be exposed cheek to jowl with the social and cultural issues and attitudes that are difficult? And in Mississippi they were, at the expense of the quality of their education? Or do we want to remove them from public school and trust the education they get elsewhere will better prepare them to engage those same issues later on down the road? These are the questions that you have to grapple with when you think about being in solidarity. And I was not alone in this. Several other volunteers shared that for them, the school choice was a perfect example of the difficulty, and I love this phrase, of administering one's privilege. It's one thing to admit and understand you have privilege, but then you need to administer that privilege. You have to figure out how to use it. And that really ties into finding a way to live a lifestyle of solidarity with the poor. Answering the question of how can I achieve this solidarity is found, however, in the other key concept that my journey over the past 18 months has brought into focus, service. I didn't really understand solidarity till I understood service. Now, you remember I asked you to think about the distinction between helping and serving. What do you feel when you help? What do you feel? If you help someone change a flat tire on the side of the road, what'd you say? Does anyone want to throw a word out? You feel good about yourself. I would say I feel satisfaction. When I serve, it's not satisfaction. If you're serving, you feel gratitude to the person you're serving. Serving is different from helping. Helping is based on inequality. It's not a relationship between equals. When you help, you use your own strength to help those of lesser strength. When we help, we may even inadvertently take away from people more than we ever give them. We may diminish their self-esteem, their sense of worth, integrity, wholeness. When I help, I'm very aware of my own strength, but we don't serve with our strength. We serve with ourselves. We draw from all our experiences. Our limitations serve. Our wounds serve. Even our darkness, our personal darkness, can serve. Service is a relationship between equals, and in serving, we achieve solidarity. I have for you now a handout, and it is a list of the guiding principles of Annunciation House. And these are the principles that have guided them for 40 years. There are 3 core principles in this list of principles from A House that I think are applicable to us here in Cambridge, whether you are a church person, not a church person. And those 3 things are accompaniment, the ministry of being with, even when we can't change the circumstances. Hospitality, breaking bread, as our neighbors at the Anglican Church do with Community Table. And witness, calling out injustice and cruelty, using the platform that our particular privilege gives us. Accompaniment, hospitality, and witness. But if you can take one thing on that sheet and modify it and use it at a small scale. For instance, there's a note in there about eating simply. And they do that as a community, the permanent staff at A House. If you decide for a week to eat simply, to eat the simplest food you can, or even to fast, and to do it with a group of people, maybe prayer partners or neighbors, as a way of heightening your own awareness of how other people are living, and focus your attention on the needs of a broken world, then you will have taken something from A House and applied it in your daily life, in your own personal spiritual journey. And maybe you'll feel that something you have no faith in has already begun to occur.